Hello and welcome to Adapt with Danette FM. My name is Danette Fenton Menzies and we are in season 3 of Adapt with Danette FM, and we are focusing this season on experimentation, which is something really important that organisations need to look at in order to continue to learn and grow and adapt. So I'm super excited to welcome in my co-hosts, Jez Fenton Menzies, or Jez FM. Jez, how are you? Welcome.
Great to be here, Danette. No, excited to be doing season 3 of Adapt. This is, of course, the companion podcast to the amazing book, The Adaptable Leader by Danette FM, which you can pick up if you want to learn how to be adaptable in this ever-changing world. It's one of the most important skills you can have. And this season, as you mentioned, we're talking about experimentation, which is part of your accepts model, which is what people will be learning about in your book. Today, we're talking to a friend of not only this show, but friend of us, Tim Jack Adams. And we'll get to him shortly. But Danette, before we do that, I think we're going to have to check in around the world and see what's happening in the news in our segment, Adapt the News. Alrighty, Danette, welcome to Adapt the News. This is a segment where we take your adaptability lens and we look at some stories from around the world to see not only how people are adapting, but how you view their adapting. So today, we're actually going to an old favorite of a website, positive.news. This is, if you listen to a couple of the other episodes, we've been here before. But the title of this article is Rethinking ADHD as Hypercuriosity. Now, this is written by Robin Everly. And this is just a sort of brief article, but I'll read the first little bit so people can kind of get the idea. What if ADHD isn't a deficit of attention, but an intensified curiosity? A new study explores how reframing the disorder could transform education. And as we go down, we basically see that there's been people that have been called, creative, mischievous people in their time. But what we find out is perhaps ADHD is not what we thought it was, which is someone that's easily distracted, but instead someone who is really interested in sort of being intensely curious in something. So, Danette, I wanted to have a listen to what your thoughts were on this topic and sort of how it relates to adaptability.
I love this reframing because the other way sort of tends to put a bit of a stigma on people, which is like we all have superpowers. We're all in a lot of ways neurodivergent because our brains are all wired differently because we've all had different experiences. And, some people see things like ADHD as a bad thing. And it's like, well, actually, a lot of first responders, and I got this from Callum McCurdy when he came on the Magical Learning podcast, and also when I interviewed him for season 1 of this, is that your first responders under pressure actually are the best people because they're able to sort through a lot of things because of that curiosity in their brain. So I love the fact that this is actually looking at, people can actually be hyper curious as opposed to people seeing it as some sort of deficit. In order for organisations to be adaptable, everyone needs to be different. They need to bring different perspectives, different ways of looking at the world, but also bring their strengths. And for every single individual, our strengths are going to be different. So if we want to be adaptable, if we want to experiment well and create safety, we need to honour that diversity rather than trying to make everyone very similar. So I love this article, and I love positive.com, positivenews.com.
I think it's positive.news.
Oh, sorry. I love positive.news.
Yeah, me too. And look, a lot of my thoughts on this were pretty similar, to be honest. And I think that when we think about that conversation you had with Callum McCurdy, and you're right, like people with ADHD are really good in a crisis because they are able to see a lot of information very quickly and start to sort of process it. As you mentioned, thinking of neurodivergence as a strength and where can we use this particular type of lens, where's that going to be an advantage, not a disadvantage? And then finally, the other thing that I was agreeing with you there is that it tips the idea from sort of like a deficit into a potential. Like how can we utilize this curiosity in our business? Like how can we use someone who has hyper curiosity? Anyway, very fascinating.
Nice.
All right. Well, Danette, we are about to chat to the fantastic Tim Jack Adams. Did you have anything that you want people to keep their eyes open for in this conversation you had with him?
What I love about Tim is he does experimentation every day in his business. He has 3 businesses, which I love. And I really love his focus on how do we work with the brain and use things like nature. Um, I love the hammock story and how he uses hammocks to expand people's views, and also trampolines. So I'm going to leave that as a
Mhm.
bit of a taster for our listeners and our viewers. You're going to love Tim. We love Tim. Yeah. Thanks, Jez. What about you?
No, I think let's just jump right into it. So, Danette, let's enjoy your conversation with Tim Jack Adams.
And I'm super excited today to have Tim Jack Adams, who we've already had on our Magical Learning podcast and had such a great podcast. So, Tim, I'd love to welcome you into our conversation today. And I'd love for you to introduce yourselves to our listeners and viewers who may not have met you yet.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I was just saying, you guys are so much fun that I had to come back on. I feel like we just stayed laughing the whole time. So I'm going to try and stick to the actual conversation and knowledge base instead of laughing so much. So my name's Tim Jack Adams. I've got 3 different companies: Team Building Guru, Water Sports Guru, and Green X7. And I actually just wrote a book called Energize, which is why we were talking last time. And basically, my whole last 15 years is really getting people to reconnect back to themselves and others, to be the best version of themselves. Really trying to innovate, not just as an individual, but also as a team, an organization, even communities. And we really work in a really wide range across many different industries. And I think every time that I put my hat on, it's always about, right, what are we going to do with this team to basically do better? And when I say do better, I mean it's everything about adaptability and innovation. Culture, actually, the original word for culture is cultus, which means care. And so these are just all the things that I love to bring in, and it's problem solving, right? Like I think I'm a problem solver, and I love solving problems. So yeah, hopefully today I can bring some knowledge experience to your audience. I would love that.
We know you will, Tim. So let's start with the first question. And this is really about your own definition. So I'd love for you to define experimentation in terms of leadership and organizations.
Mm. So I think for me, experimentation is almost an everyday aspect of our 3 companies. And the reason I say that is because every time that we're creating a product, thinking about our client, even working with our staff, you're always thinking about what is the best way to do that moving forward. And, even when I was thinking about stuff, we just rolled out a disc profiling thing for one of the, Olympic Australian teams. And even just that in itself, understanding, everybody's disc profile, how we adapt to that personality, how do we then talk to them and lead them forward? And then we sort of put a big team building session around that. And even just that in itself, we realized at the end of the session, there was so many little changes that we realized that we had to make within each team, within each ability, about how do we adapt to make sure that as a culture and working with 70 people in our organization, that we can actually move forward, and in a better direction. So that in itself is like, it's an everyday occurrence. I don't think you can ever move forward without doing it.
And that's why we love you on this podcast, Tim, because not everyone has that sort of mindset. Like it is something that for some people they struggle with, which is why I'm sure they'll listen to you and go, "Oh, I never thought of it as something we do every day," which is actually a really
Mm.
important point. So then I'd love to hear an example of a situation where experimentation really worked, and what caused that to work really well.
Mm. I think the one that came to mind as soon as you said that. So back in 2012, when we were starting with Green X7, we asked that one question: why is it when we actively engage in nature, are we healthier and happier? We literally spent 3 years experimenting around those 7 tools. And now we eventually came up with that framework, which was, movement, environment, earthing, time, connection, reflection, and breath. But throughout that whole time, we were literally taking, the white papers, the science, the data. We were talking to practitioners. We were talking to the everyday person. And we literally experimented for those 3 years to really understand, okay, this is what the science says. But does that actually convert into what a practical everyday person, team, and organization can apply to their daily lives? And there was so many things that, they said, hey, this is amazing, best practice, but it would never actually work on a day-to-day basis. It was just far too long. We couldn't spend an hour doing that one thing each and every day. And so when we came up with those 7 tools, we realized that with, the little time that we already have in our very busy lives, how do I create something for an individual, a team, a leader to actually improve their well-being as quickly as possible with the most amount of benefits? And I think I'm just looking down now because I can see them on my shelf. I literally have about 12 journals. They're called Books of Dreams, Danette. And all of that has experimentation. Like if I open one now, it would literally say, on this day, I tried this. Did it work? Not great. Let's try this. So I think, just from that point of view, look, eventually it worked after 3 years. We found the magic formula. It's been amazing since. But that's one example that have worked. There's been a lot that haven't worked. I can guarantee you that.
And what I loved about your answer there, Tim, is you asked a beautiful question. And I also loved that you captured the data as you went
Mm,
as part of that experiment. So, we could look at those journals and that would be so much fun. Maybe you can take a photo and we can put one of them
we
with
can do
the
that.
podcast
Yeah, we could do
um,
that.
description, because it is, not everything's going to work. And I always think of, what's his name with the light bulb? Edison. I was going to say Einstein, but I'm like, it's not Einstein. So Edison, and he tried the light bulb many, many times before he got there. And it's really easy, I think, for some people, if it doesn't work first time, it's like, oh, I'll quit. Whereas actually, hearing your story, it is constant. And
Mm.
3 years before you got something that you all went, yeah, that's it. And sticking with that. So I'm curious, how do you keep yourself motivated when it's not
Mm.
turning up every day? You're experimenting, but maybe it's not hitting the mark yet.
Oh, and that's such a good question. And I got to admit, right now we're actually going through that same period again. We've spent the last 6 months experimenting with a program that we're rolling out. We've for the last 10 years in Australia, we've been talking about employee, assistance programs. And what we know now is that, they're great when someone it basically burns out or has a psychosocial issue or physical health, but we're trying to prevent people from actually accessing an EAP, right? And so for the last 6 months, because of our battery check, it's a proactive leading data platform, we're really working out how do we, we're never going to replace an EAP because they're very important, but how do we actually, work alongside an EAP? And so we have both programs running simultaneously. So, we use this preventative platform to hopefully, have less people access the EAP. But because an EAP is so embedded in the Australian culture of organizations, it's very hard for HR and, the psychological side of going, we've put all this money invested into an EAP, maybe we don't have the time, the headspace, the money for a preventative, proactive program. And look, let's be honest, it's not just organizations, it's our health system as well. So my team and I and our board, we are at this struggling point where we're going, we know that we have something that is really good, but it's almost like it's falling on deaf ears because no one wants to know about it. So at the moment, I think, we have a very strong purpose at Green X7, but even ourselves, sometimes I feel like we're banging our head against the wall. So yeah, I'm going through it all over again, Danette, as
You
we
poor
all do.
ouch, yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've got some ideas. We'll talk after this.
Okay, wonderful.
So then let's flip to the challenge side. So what challenge have you seen when it comes to experimentation? Then I'll ask the next question.
Well, I think it always comes down to time and resources, right? So as an organization, you only have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of resources. And when you look at a project, you kind of have a bucket, and I'll just talk from my own experience. And I'd say, right, we have this amount of time as a team that we can put into this new project because obviously we're busy running our other programs and we only have this amount of resources. And yes, you can, raise capital, you can do all these things. But look, we love to grow organically at Green X7. It's sort of something that allows us to hold on to our purpose and vision and mission without anyone else coming in and, telling us, where the money should be going. And so I think that, for this runway, we've given ourselves, about a year. We know how much resources we've got. We've got the team, we're bringing some more people on. And I just think every single day you kind of see the time and resources dwindling, and you kind of go, right, are we going to succeed in this amount of time and the resource we've given ourselves? And what if we don't? And it's kind of one of those things, because we can always play small, right? This is the constant struggle that I have with our company, because we're very successful at this level, but we want to be at this level. So how do we do that without, number one, burning ourselves out, because that's the most important thing, losing our resources, which is time and money at the same time. But maybe it works and we go, ha, look at that, like, we did it, team, like, yes, we've solved that problem. Constant struggle all the time.
That's a great answer. So then, is there an example where you've seen experimenting not working? And I'd be
Mm.
curious about why you thought that didn't work.
Yeah, so the first one that came to mind when COVID hit, we were working for a lot of international companies, Six Senses, Alila, these are wellness resorts. And because my work back then was flying in, doing face-to-face leaderships over 3 days, when COVID hit, they all came and said, hey, Timmy, like, what are we going to do now? Like, we can't have face-to-face. We still need employee well-being. We still want our leadership. So we kind of went back to the drawing board. We created this, we have an app already, but we created this back end, which was called an 8-week challenge. And it was an online thing that delved deeper into purpose, sleep, physical health, all those things that we measure with your battery. And the reason why it didn't work, there's 2 reasons. One is we are a company that really thrive on face-to-face connections, and that is part of the magic that we bring to an organization. The other reason why it didn't survive is because the borders opened and everyone went back to saying, hey, Timmy, thanks for the awesome program, but can you just come back to us now face-to-face? So we spent I think we spent 6 months and a lot of money investing into a program that basically everyone loved until the borders opened up, and then it was not necessary anymore. So yes, hindsight's a wonderful thing.
But I like that you adapt, borders closed, let's try something new. Borders open, okay, let's put that to one side again. Yeah, and again, that's sort of displaying all of the things that your companies are about and the whole adapting and experimenting. That's why you are successful. So love that story. So my next one is, how do organizations actually allow for more experimentation? Because I think a lot of organizations aren't particularly good at this yet.
Okay, so the first thing that came to mind was be open to creativity. I think sometimes we think creativity is only for the creative, right? And if I was to think about my parents, both very creative, I didn't get so I can't paint, I can't sing, I can't play a musical instrument. I can't do any of the things that my parents can do. And so I didn't think I was creative whatsoever. But what I'd realized is that the companies that I've created, you're creating every single day. The products that you're creating is based around what you have in your imagination and the knowledge you have, and building something that you're actually going to put out to the world, the same way that you would create, any piece of music or any piece of art. It's just a different creative form or medium. And so I think, number one, organizations, they can get very stale. And I think it's my role when I work with the leadership's team is to get them to unlock it's a terrible word to say, but unlock the scalability of their organization. And this is where I love taking people into nature, because nature in itself has that way to actually unlock creativity. It opens those spaces, in those minds, and the science behind it's quite phenomenal. But that's the first thing we have to get people to do, is realize that, hey, you might not be able to paint, sing, or play a song, but you have other ways to be creative in the way that your brain works. The second thing is actually allowing time for it. I think what I constantly see is that our calendars are just so flat out and fully booked with things that we have to do, right? Like the meetings and these, but we don't actually allow ourselves time to just think, be bored, be creative, actually have brainstorming sessions around God knows what comes up. And so I think one of my favorite things is that sometimes if a leadership team allows me time, like, right, I set up some hammocks, and this is one of my favorite things. I love doing this. So we'll either go, into a forest or along a beach, and we'll actually just put up some hammocks in a circle, whatever it looks like for people, and we'll actually just chew the fat. And because you're in such a different environment, right, and you're sitting on hammocks, you're not dressed in the suits, you're very casual, thinking changes, right? Trust opens up. And it's quite amazing the creativity and conversations that come when you say, hey, I want you to think about absolutely anything you want, right? And let's try and use that to create our next conversation moving forward. Not talking about P&Ls and, what the next quarter is going to look like. But look, if you had a magic wand, right, and you could create anything that you wanted for this company to do better and to thrive, what does that look like? Like, let's just Peter Pan this all the way through. And, sometimes it takes a while to really open out those neurons, right, and get people to think differently. But from a little nice, gentle facilitation, it's quite amazing what products will actually come from those conversations and the different directions and tangents that they might not have ever thought about going on. And I think for me, that's something that really inspires me. And I kind of have to remember myself sometimes to take my team out. And actually, we did it on a trampoline the other day. I was like, we had this big trampoline at our house because of my kids. And I was like, right, I've got my team together. We need to do a strategy session. I need them to think different. I need them to be playful. How am I going to create this environment? And I was like, right, my kids' trampoline. So we all sat out there on a trampoline, and because it transported us back to our childhood memories. And the session was around how do we create more play for organizations? Because we understand how important play is for trust, creativity, and culture. So I was like, right, well, we need to play ourselves. We need to get back into that heartfelt emotions of what play is. And look, I know it's a little bit unconventional, but God, we actually did come up with some great ideas. And it definitely connected us more as a team as well.
Oh, Tim, the next podcast we do, we'll have to have trampolines or hammocks or something.
So good.
So my next question is, why is it important for leaders and organizations that want to adapt? Why should they experiment more?
Hmm. Well, I think because the world's constantly moving, right? It's never stale. As human beings, we need to grow. We need progress. I think even just at a pure individual biological level, we know that one of our biggest purposes in life is to actually grow as a human being, and because individuals make up teams and organizations, then that's obviously going to follow through. And so one thing is obviously purely just to keep up, with the innovation of others. I think once we stop, we start to go backwards, and then obviously that's not great for P&Ls. But I think just innately as human beings, and I know that if I look at my team, as much as that we're always trying to say, hey, we've created a great product, let's just go and sell it, let's just go and do it. It always comes back to, but you know what? I reckon we can make this better. I reckon if we can just tweak this here a little bit, we might get a little bit more adoption, which is going to create a little bit more sustainability. And it's hilarious because sales and marketing are just like, stop it, stop creating. We've got enough. Let's just get out there and do what we do. And I'm like, but it can be better, guys. It can be better. And the team are just like, stop it, Timmy. That's enough. No more products. So it's like this constant struggle. And I don't know, I think, I've never been in a situation where no one wants to grow, and maybe they just wouldn't let me in because they would know that I would just completely destroy their internal workings of that organization. But I don't know, it just comes so natural for me to actually always problem solve and want to look at something and how do I improve it.
So that leads me to, you've got this beautiful tool, the battery check, and these are just my thoughts, that in order to experiment, in order to adapt, it's much easier if your battery is charged reasonably high rather than when it's fairly flat. So would you like to explain to our listeners and viewers a little bit about the battery check, and then just that thought about how important it might be to be working on yourself to improve your battery?
So the battery check came about in 2017. So when I was talking about those 7 tools were created, from 2012 to 15, it was what we found was the greatest way to amplify your well-being and recharge your wellness in minutes. But we were doing this for quite a few years, and it was always the same thing, Danette, that Timmy, how do we actually measure this? How do we know it works? Like, it feels great. Teams love it. We all come back singing hooray, but CFO, CEO, we all want to be able to measure this, Timmy. And I think back then we didn't actually have a really quick, easy way to measure well-being. And very interesting, because all of the organizations, we put in EAPs, we put well-being programs in, but they're not measurable. And so we had to go back to the board and find out, number one, what is well-being, what makes up well-being, and then how do we measure it, and how do we actually talk about it? So we realized that, there was these 8 things: purpose, sleep, physical health, nutrition, mindset, fun, relationships, and friendships. These are the things that actually make up what well-being is. And we realized that if we created this app, we could actually ask a very simple question from, 1 to 10, how is your sleep? How is your purpose? And that would actually give you a battery. And that battery, as simple as it sounds, is literally, how connected you are, how much energy you have, how much productivity. Quite simple, but quite amazing, because it all happens in 60 seconds. And so for the last 7 years, I've been on the front row seat of working with teams and organizations and leaders and watching their comparison of what battery level they're at. So whether that's surviving, functioning, or thriving, and how productive they are, how much of an inspiring leader they are, how connected, their culture, and across the board. And we realize that, the lower the battery, basically the worse culture, the less energy you have to be productive. And obviously the higher the battery, we saw that, the more inspiring culture, the more engaging, the more productivity that was coming about. And I kind of have this thing now that every time I walk into a team or walk into an organization, I kind of guess what I think the battery is going to be at based on what I'm reading from the room, the way that the team interacts with each other. And I'm getting pretty close. I think I've got this down pat. If I was a betting man, I'd start to put a tab around it. And so what I realize is that for myself, because I am my greatest experiment, because I've been doing this with myself for 12 years. I've been biohacking everything in my life to work out, what works best. And look, I always know I'm currently sitting at around 85%, I think, with my battery. Having 2 kids under the age of 4 is not helping with my sleep and fun. But I certainly know that when my battery is high, I have not just the energy, but it's almost it's something else that fires me up, that allows me to wake up in the morning and go, yeah, this is an innovation day. This is a day that I get to experiment, because I actually have the energy to do so. And I find when I'm flat, it's really hard, because I'm not motivated myself. When my battery is low, I really struggle with the motivation to want to think differently, to want to actually get outside of the norm and actually create something different. So I think for me, when I work with teams, we take a benchmark. The average organizational battery is 64% at the moment. And I know just from it's crazy, it's terrible. I know from my own experimentation over the last 8 years that is not an environment where adaptability and innovation and creativity can happen, because they're functioning, right? Like, they're close to survival mode. And, to really innovate, to really adapt, to really experiment, I believe personally, from everything that we've worked on, is that, you really need to be pushing above that 75, 80% and above to do it sustainably as well, right? And that's the point, is that organizations think just because they can have a sprint and go hard and then burn out, that no, please don't. Let's thrive sustainably and actually keep those organizations constantly innovating, constantly adapting. Sorry, that was so long-winded, Danette, but always thinking.
And Tim, we're going to put the link to the battery check in the description of the podcast, because for our listeners and viewers, it's a free check, but it is fabulous. And just for that self-awareness, because I suppose as leaders, if we're low, we're probably actually not that self-aware, and we're not aware of the impact we're having on others as well. So that was not a long-winded answer. That was actually an awesome answer, Tim. So thank you. So my next question, and I can't believe it's the last question already, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners and our viewers around experimentation?
Yeah, I think, if you're going to be completely honest and open, it can seem daunting, and it can seem scary. And I think that, sometimes, even for myself, that, I'm a founder of 3 different companies. Sometimes it's easier to play small, right? It's easier to continue just doing the things that you know that work. Like I could literally just stick with the same programs, and I know they're successful. We have clients coming back every single year, and I could just keep rolling them out. But the thing is, there's something inside of me, and I'm sure the other listeners understand this as well. There's something inside us that kind of says that, hey, you know, that you've got something inside you that could be better, right? That would be more that would be better suited for this person or this organization. And I bet you if you just put a little bit of time and energy and resources in trying to solve this problem, you'd feel pretty damn good about being able to help that organization or person. And I think that, every time that we sit down as a team, we have this line that gets drawn in the sand, right? And it's that line that says, we can just stay where we are and we'll be successful, or we could really see what we're made of. And it kind of reminds me of that, the Teddy Roosevelt quote, the man in the arena. And every time I kind of go through a little bit of I'm done now. I go back and I've got it on my wall. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's not the critic who counts. And I go back and I read that and I go, you know what? I want to be the guy that's in the arena, bloodied and sweaty and marred and muddy, with the scars to show that, at the end of the day, I've really tried my very, very best. And I think at the end of our life, if that's all we have to hang our hat on, that we've tried our very best, whether we were successful or just success in the fact that we know that we did, I think that for me is my internal guide and flame that keeps me going. And I think any time that if anyone gets down and out, and look, I had a fellow author that, sent me a message the other day. He's only a young fella and he was kind of struggling a bit, right? And I sent him the man in the arena quote and he goes, Timmy, thank you, mate, because sometimes our self-esteem can get hit, right? And if it gets hit too many times, we kind of get deflated and our confidence goes. But just by saying and reading that quote, it's really helped me understand that, I am giving it my best shot and I'm trying my bloody best. And you know what? That's enough. Like, as long as you do your best, that's enough. So went off tangent there, but so.
I love it. So my go-to when I go into that is Marianne Williamson's Our Deepest Fear, where she talks about, we can shrink ourselves or we can shine and we give others permission to shine. It's just that reminder to come back. And what I loved about your language, Tim, and you may not be aware of this, is you weren't beating yourself up if you didn't hit it. You were doing it in a kind, loving way to continue to grow, but you weren't coming back to, failure and stuff like that. You actually had beautiful language around it's okay to experiment. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it doesn't, but you're not going to quit because it didn't work. You're just going to keep growing yourself. But coming back to your message around sustainability, it was around that, from what I heard, the kind energy, the loving energy, to keep just believing you can. And it's okay when you take that hit to remind yourself, okay, I can take a breath and then keep going forward. So I just loved how you answered that last question too.
Thank you,
Just
Danette. And
you're welcome.
and I think failing's an interesting word, right? Because, probably back in the past when I wasn't quite in the mindset that I am now, I would have used the word failing, but I think it's just lessons learned, right? And if you can look at lessons learned, just like Edison did, I don't know, God knows how many thousands of times he tried to create the light bulb, but God, I reckon that his mindset would have been lessons learned, not, failures along the way. So if people are listening and they say that, I am failing or I'm doing this, as long as you are trying to grow, as long as you are each and every day trying to move forward in a positive direction, then it's never a failure, right? It's always just lessons learned. And God, I don't know how many lessons I've learned along the way, and I'll always keep continuing to learn lessons. But I tell you what, life's never boring, that's for sure.
Yes, you're alive every day, don't you, Tim?
Certainly do.
So I reckon we've got some listeners and viewers that would love to reach out to you. So where are the best places for people to find you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn's probably a really good one under Tim Jack Adams. Our website's greenx7.com, timjackadams.com.au. But yeah, always happy for anyone to reach out and have a really good conversation about growing, for sure.
Nice. Well, Tim, can I say thank you so much for joining us on Adapt with Danette FM, and to all of our listeners and viewers, stay adaptable.
And what a great chat that was with Tim.
Yeah.
I loved this one, and it's always great to hear from him. And if people like this chat, there's also the magical learning if you want to continue that conversation, hear a little bit more. But Danette, from this conversation here, what did you like and what did you take away?
So I think, Tim's point about, everyone in the organization needs to be creative, not necessarily artistic, but creative in their own way. So providing the space for people to experiment, recognizing that, the moment you get outside and you're in nature, that's going to help your brain think bigger picture, and be able to experiment. And just making it a normal part of the daily practice of an organization, because if we're not experimenting and learning and growing, eventually we're not going to be around. So some great messages from Tim, and I love that he embodies this in his organizations. What about you,
Abso-
Jed?
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, you mentioned this a little bit before the conversation, but just his understanding of how important nature is and then how we should all incorporate it. And then the other thing is that I love that he has a little battery check that he can sort of run, that we can all run that because you don't always think about checking your own battery, but it's good to have a tool that can sort of give you some sort of coordinates of roughly where you might be. So I think I'm always thankful for him for making that as well.
Yes.
Well, Danette, Tim isn't the only person that'll be having a chat with you today, other than me, because people can write in our segment, Ask and Adapt. Alrighty, everybody, welcome to Ask and Adapt. This is where you can write into Danette and ask questions about adaptability, experimentation, or anything that you want to get Danette's unique adaptability lens on. You can send those questions either on Spotify or YouTube and leave a comment, or you can send it to adaptwithdanette@gmail.com. Danette, today's conversation starter here is from Lucy, and Lucy's written in, Dear Danette, I love this podcast and I'm listening to season 2 at the moment. I was wondering what role mental health plays in experimentation. Thank you, Lucy.
Great question, Lucy. Mental health is so important for, not just experimentation, but a good life. And so looking after your mental health, super, super important. And I think one of the things that we know works in organizations is where they make it psychologically safe for people to bring, their views of situations, their ability to take risks and not be beaten over the head or blamed, but instead those opportunities where maybe something didn't work in an experiment, we use to learn and grow. So I think it's important we all look after our own mental health. Obviously, workplaces creating really good environments for people to be able to come and experiment. Because ultimately, if we're not feeling good from a mental health perspective, it's really hard to experiment because you're really just surviving. And so if you need help, please reach out to professionals to support you. It is not anything to do with shame. A lot of people feel shame when they're, not mentally strong. I often think about it as you've often supported many other people and it's now your body's turn to look after itself. So please, if you need help, please seek help.
Mm. Yeah, and sort of on the flip side of that, Danette, like my thing with this is that if you think about something like silliness,
Yes,
that's all experimentation, and that
it is.
really can only be done in a really sort of open. The more open the environment, the better. This is something that we kind of learned earlier from Brent Forrester, and he's talking about sort of creativity, but. From this, when I think about experimentation, when you want to get into that really experimental zone, you have to be really safe. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And Tim even talked about fun.
Mm.
Yeah, and that silliness and the fun, that's when we're working with our brain and, it just helps us experiment and see things we wouldn't see if we were really serious. So great question, Lucy. Thank you so much for writing into us.
Mm-hmm.
Really
Well,
appreciate it.
yes, thank you very much, Lucy. And to anybody else that wants to write in, that email address is, again, adaptwithdanette@gmail.com. Now, Danette, before we leave our listeners and viewers today, and if you are a listener that wants to be a viewer, you can head over to Spotify and YouTube and you can check that out. But, Danette, do you have anything you wanted to leave people with today?
Yes, as always, stay adaptable.